Hi everyone, welcome to the Ex-Tankie Podcast, where I talk to experts about the politics of war crimes and genocide denial. Today I'm joined by Patrick Hilsman. Patrick is a freelance journalist who writes primarily about Syria, arms trafficking, drones and drug policy. He's worked for Vice, The Intercept, The Daily Beast, Middle East Eye, as well as contributing to a recent documentary for Al Jazeera called The Hunt for Assad's Executioners, about tracking down former members of the Syrian regime complicit in war crimes now living freely in Europe. This is part one of my discussion with Patrick, which was recorded earlier last year. This episode was recorded in the aftermath of the recent Israeli incursion into Gaza, so we discussed that extensively, but the discussion begins with an exploration of Patrick's experiences in Syria. We then moved on to discuss Islamophobic narratives about Syria. In part two of my discussion with Patrick, which I hope to release soon after this one, we're going to be talking about the controversies surrounding chemical weapon attacks in Syria. Thank you for listening.
And also, you wanted me to talk a little bit more about my experiences.
Yeah.
It's hard to describe because so much changes, right? Like from the different trips that I had to Aleppo, I went to Aleppo in 2012, 2013, and 2014. And I went very briefly into northern Syria in 2015. And then I went to Rojava in 2018, right? And having seen the way that the conflict changed in that time is really like it's strange to just think of it, because like Aleppo has been a place that was accessible to me. The first time I went in, I just drove in a car with a fixer. Easy, right? I've ridden in taxis in Aleppo. I've taken mini buses to leave before. Like it's unbelievable how accessible it was. At first. Now, very early on, there was this Islamist element, right? And there's one thing that I think that is actually important that when we're dealing with this like tanky bullshit to address is the fact is that these extremists were always going to be a problem. Like there's the idea that they were never present, or that they that there wasn't this extremist strain among the rebels always, I think is plainly false. I think that there was a sincere rebellion. There were sincere rebels, unquestionably there were people just fighting for their freedom. And I don't deny that in the slightest, but the idea that that extremists weren't trying to exploit it immediately is silly. Of course they were trying to exploit it. And it's a cynical game. But the fact is that just, I remember days when I was able to, at one point I went to go visit a friend in Aleppo in 2013 during a time when Nusra was starting to take over civic institutions. And they were starting to take over checkpoints across the city, sort of like encroaching in on civil society, becoming more and more menacing, all the while the regime is bombing from the air. And I remember I got a chance to just sort of take a stroll in the park with a friend, right? And we were kind of just talking about the situation and about how like it was becoming more extreme and how people were becoming more desperate and the situation was becoming more untenable. And it was just really strange because I remember just feeling this kind of freedom then, but it's like I was unarmed. I didn't have any militant or anything with me. I was just with a friend in the park, an American in the park. And I would have people come up to me, say where I'm from, I'd say America. And I'll send you the clip of me hiding in a stairwell when a jet flew over. But in that clip, somebody asked me, where are you from? Britain? And I say, America. And it's funny to me looking at it now because I didn't have a second thought, because it wasn't, we were always aware of these kind of like extremist kidnap gangs, and they were present, but it was not, there was like the idea that you would be afraid of people for being American or for being different from them was not rational. Like there was a kind of freedom there that was maybe not necessarily political, but it was like people were living in a state of near enslavement, and they rose up. And when something like that happens, a lot of very beautiful and ugly things happen. And you can see it's a precious thing to have been able to sort of just walk around in Aleppo on my own with friends that weren't like military people, because I got a chance to sort of just sit there in the park and hear the explosions in the distance and see the helicopters going around and talk to some people that were fiercely pro-revolution, but just terrified of Nusra. and to get to see like this dynamic shifting on the ground, and to see the obvious rise of extremism happening in the context of desperation as the cities were being emptied by barrel bombing. It was like a privilege to have been able to experience that as an American, as somebody that wasn't supposed to be there, and as somebody that wasn't allowed to be there by the government, that I was able to sort of have a civilian experience in the city. And I think that I often talk about the fact that I wouldn't as a journalist witness an execution, because I think that I think that if you were to be a witness at an execution, I think you'd be obligated to, even if you can't do anything to stop it, but I think you'd be obligated to say, dude, you're a prison guard. Are you a Christian? If you're a Christian, you shouldn't do this. You know, like, I think you'd be obligated to try to reason with everyone there, to say something, to cause a scene, right? Because if you're just there to say, oh, they fucking killed this person based on our stupid justice system, you know, I just don't really think that you've fulfilled your obligations. Like, I don't think that's journalism. I really don't. Now, if you were to sneak a camera in, then yeah, I would, you know, because you're violating the rules. And in a way, I feel like covering a war is kind of like, to do it right, you have to be, somebody has to want to kill you for being there to like do it right. You know, a lot of people should want to kill you for being there to do it right. And being able to kind of just witness the key regime strategy from day one has been try to obscure the atrocities, you know, and the lengths they were willing to go to achieve that were horrifying. And we're seeing them repeated, not just on the Syrian model, but also on the Gaza model, over and over again. And I think anybody that thinks that these kinds of atrocities would not be carried out in broad daylight with the world watching because people are quote unquote rational actors should look at Gaza right now and should see what like quote unquote rational actors do. You know, because it's completely blatant. I mean, like they blow up a hospital and they say we didn't target a hospital. Like there's no, the Israelis aren't even attempting to justify what they're doing. There's just a built-in assumption is we think you're full of shit, or we take you all for idiots, and we don't care if you see what we're doing, right? And to look at a situation like Syria and to think that they don't think exactly the same way is ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
Totally, yeah, and it's very valuable hearing your firsthand personal experience.
I'll also talk about some of my experience with the white helmets briefly too.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Well, in Azaz was a really interesting experience. That's right on the border with Turkey, and I didn't even know that they had a facility in Azaz. I'm not even sure if I'd heard of them. I'm trying to think if I might have like peripherally heard of them before, but we were just driving around in Azaz, and we asked like, "What's this building?" Right? They said, "Oh, it's civil defense," and we said, "Do you mind if we go in?" "No, let's go." Just went in. Talk to some of the guys. I have some photos, I have some clips I'll send you. And it was just amazing how open some of them were. Like a lot of them, one of them was this old guy who had been a firefighter with the regime up to the revolution. And he had been, according to him, he had been treating protesters who were wounded, and the regime like removed his pension or something and his job as a fireman, because he was doing that, and he got stuck in that situation. And then after Azaz was liberated from the regime, he ended up working like rescuing people there, and eventually joined civil defense. But when I went to Azaz in 2014, I'd been there before, but there was the ISIS occupation of Azaz, which was between 2013 and 2014. And this was a couple months after ISIS had been kicked out. And it was very interesting to hear the stories of this guy who was there with the white helmets about how his son had been kidnapped by ISIS. And it was also interesting that how just like the way that a lot of, I wish more people would be able to see some of these stories, because you'll have people come up to you and show you photos of them when they were released from prison, just like Holocaust skinny, right? And I'll say, can I take a photo of this? There's many situations where I say, can I take a photo of you being so skinny, right? And the people would say, no, don't do that, right? Because it'll make me a target. And so it's interesting to see all the evidence that people are afraid to release, right? Like there's no motive for a person to just show a journalist a photo of them skinny after being released from like what's essentially a death camp, and then disallow the journalist to take a photo of it, right? Like these people are afraid to tell their stories. And yeah, and it was just very eye-opening to see like how willing to talk about how desperate and like unusual their situation was. Like for example, they didn't even have any like this guy whose son was kidnapped by ISIS. I was telling him like I was like, what are you doing to try and get your son back? And he said, oh, I have to go to a town that's like between ISIS territory and the territory of the other rebel groups to try and negotiate for him. And we're trying to negotiate a price, right? Now, there was no propagandistic, like, there's no value of that, right? Like, it had no propagandistic values. I have to go talk to ISIS to try and convince them to release my son. You know, he wasn't like, I'm going to go gun all of them down. I mean, he would have wanted to. He hates them because they kidnapped his son and were threatening to kill his son. He's not a fan of theirs. But his appraisal of his own situation was very bleak. Seemed pretty true from what you could tell, because there's very little motive to lie about some of these things. And it's consistent with what we've seen over and over and over again. And the idea that people would just fake these atrocities like Al-Latamina or Sarakeb or Khan Sheikhoun, right? Only to have most of them go completely unnoticed, or to have people be afraid to be quoted in the media because they're afraid that the regime will go after their families. It doesn't, this idea of exaggerated suffering is ridiculous, because exposing your suffering in any way is already fraud and dangerous. And also, I was with my friend Molly and I were in Zaz. Actually, this is not even the same day. It's interesting that there was, recently I did a piece recently for Haaretz about Israeli drone technology being sold to the Russians.
It's a really great piece. I'd
Thank you. Thanks.
recommend everyone go read it.
Definitely, yeah. It's called, but the Russians released footage of a 4-post drone, which is the Israeli IAI searcher, but rebranded in a Russian way, filming a hospital that they blew up. And after a while, I looked at the footage and I said, this is a hospital in Azaz. And I said, I must have been to this hospital because Azaz is not that big. And I went through my old footage and I was saying, I feel like we interviewed a doctor in this hospital who was talking about something about the hospital being targeted and yada, yada. And I found an interview with a doctor and I was looking at it and I was trying to geolocate it and like figure it out. And I was saying, this isn't the same structure. What the fuck is going on? And then I remembered, oh wait, there's 3 hospitals in Azaz, right? And one of the days that I was there, I remember we heard about an airstrike, right? And then we drove out of town to where the hospital was, and we just went to the site where the airstrike was. It was in the fields right next to the hospital, and we interviewed a guy who had been wounded in the airstrike. Like that simply. And it's the same fucking hospital. So one of the days that I was there, the regime had tried to target it, presumably using like dumb bombs in an aircraft. And they hit the fields next to it, and they injured a guy who's standing there. And then in 2016, 2 years later, the Russians finished the job with a guided missile. Now, it could seem crazy, like why the fuck did they give a shit about this rural hospital? About this rural hospital in northern Syria in an area they know they're probably not going to reconquer, right? And the answer is that it's because, first off, they know they'll never win. Right? They'll never win, the Assad regime. It takes 1,000 years, they'll never win. Because around half of the population of the country lives outside of their control, right? They have some base of support, obviously, but they don't have like a fanatical base of support that wants to die for them. And they have a cause that is unwon, that cannot be won without like a total war that engages every single element of their society, and they just don't have the resources for it. So what you have now is essentially a frozen conflict with intimidation and terror being the only tools left in the tools that they started with are the tools that they have now, but amplified on a larger scale. And it's no different than the logic behind targeting Gaza when they have nothing, right? Like Gaza has nothing to resist Israel. Israel talks about the rockets that are launched out of there. Okay, fine, that has endangered some civilians, but it's just how that would in any way justify blowing up a media office or killing the children of Hamas members or blowing up tunnels that they know that some of those tunnels are only to smuggle, like things that people actually need. Like they know that for some people it's a business and they're apolitical. They know that luxury cars have been smuggled through those tunnels. Like there's all kinds of capitalism takes over in like every situation. And the Israelis know that they've created an incentive for people to tunnel the fuck out of Gaza because they've turned it into an open air prison, And so people are going to escape. It's the prerogative of a prisoner to escape, especially if they're innocent, like the people of Gaza. And to see like what's happening, where you could easily just say of the Israelis, oh, they've won, right? Like they have the power. They have all the power in the world. Why would they tell the media offices to evacuate, then let them film as they bombed the media tower in central Gaza, right? And it's simple, is that they believe their own bullshit on some level, and the Russians believe their own bullshit on some level, and the Americans believe their own bullshit on some level, and the factor that always should stupefy us is people that are third parties that are stupid enough to make themselves a part of that denial. That should mystify us. The fact that Israel says we had good intentions when we targeted a hospital should surprise us. The fact that Putin, blatantly targets medical facilities for years in Idlib should not surprise us. The fact that anybody that's capable of looking at it, of looking at all the evidence, would buy this should trouble us and should be surprising and disturbing.
That's great. Thank you. So my next question is, one of the primary tactics that's been used by the Grey Zone to attack the new BBC series about the White Helmets called Mayday is to smear a translator and researcher who worked on the series called Abd al-Qadir Herbak, who according to them is linked to Al-Qaeda because, and I'm quoting here, he was chatting with terrorists who had given children chips prior to using the same chips to lure children to their deaths. That was during a terrorist attack in 2017, I believe. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, that he was also apparently present at Khan Sheikhoun at the precise moment it was allegedly subjected to a chemical attack. Footage of the incident showed him seemingly unfazed by the purported strike. So how do you respond to these allegations?
Well, they're both false. Would be the response, but we will get into that detail. So first off, we have to start with the fact that the way to respond to a long-form podcast that criticizes a conspiracy theory your website has put forward for years generally isn't to accuse two of the main people who worked on it of being a spy and a terrorist, right? Generally speaking, when somebody says, yeah, well, we disagree, but you're a spy and he's a terrorist, people say, do you mind following that up a little? And the evidence that's been provided, of course, is ludicrous. It's somehow that one of the journalists has interviewed people that formerly were military, which is, you're a journalist, you interview people. And so debunking the accusation that one of the journalists worked on it is a spy is easy because it's not based on any evidence or understanding of how these things work. But the accusation that the translator and researcher is linked to Al-Qaeda is even more egregious, and it can be debunked simply by looking at a timeline of the events described. So the accusation that Grey Zone makes against Herbak, that he was present at that he was communicating with terrorists that were responsible for the 2017 suicide bombing in Rashdin that killed over 100 civilians who were being evacuated from Fua and Krafaya, which are two sort of twin villages that have a largely Shia population inside of Idlib. These two towns were besieged by Al-Qaeda-linked rebels for a very long time. And in 2017, a deal was struck to exchange them for other civilians that were under siege that were under siege by the government. And the militant groups that were surrounding Fua and Krafaya agreed and a deal was struck, and buses were sent in to evacuate the populations of Fua and Rafaya. As the population were being evacuated from Idlib, they passed through a town in Aleppo province called Raishdin for a transfer and a stop-off. And during that point, a blue truck drove in to the crowd, which was milling about, which included people eating food, and and the crowd included civilians from the opposition side. It included government soldiers. It included rebels. It included rescue workers who wore white helmets. It included rescue workers who were part of the SARC. And a suicide bomber drove into the truck and blew him up and killed over 100 people. People who were injured, rebels were injured. Civilians from the opposition side were injured. Hundreds of civilians from the government side. It's not fair to say they're from the government, but who were living in areas that were controlled by the government were killed. It was a terrible terrorist incident that was clearly aimed at disrupting the negotiation that had taken place. And it was clearly conducted by somebody that was willing to kill rebel fighters because, as far as we can see, they did. And also, on top of that, the suicide vehicle has been identified as a blue truck that likely had some kind of false bottom in it holding the explosive. It wasn't the chips distribution van that was named by the Gray Zone. And this is known. This is something that's been deeply analyzed and looked at, and it doesn't have any substance. So moving further from the fact that their accusation that he was chatting with the people who were the terrorists is false, because those aren't the people that set off the bomb, we can move further to the fact that he actually rescued a child during this incident. And there's an image of him running towards the blown up buses because he had seen a child moving who was badly burned and injured, and pulling him out of there. And you got to understand that a lot of these types of attacks involve a second detonation. A lot of the time, whether it's airstrikes or a suicide bombing, people will try and lure in rescuers and then they'll hit it again. And during that, this man risked his life to save a Shia child. In a war that's been characterized by brutality of the government and extremism of the opposition, and extremism of the government as well, right? And he risked his life to save a child from this terrorist attack. And the Gray Zone's response to the very meticulous work that was done debunking a lot of their bullshit was to say, oh, yeah, he partook in the murder of these children. So they've accused someone who criticized them. I repeat, they have accused someone who criticized them of taking part in a suicide bombing. And all one has to do to prove that he didn't take part in the suicide bombing is just Google which fucking vehicle was responsible for the suicide bombing. And it debunks itself. The claim is bullshit. If it was a claim that was made in England and we were dealing with citizens of England all around, it would be a lawsuit for the ages. If they are ever in England, both at the same time, the Gray Zone is fucked. And but it's a ludicrous accusation against somebody that saved a child from a different sect during a sectarian war. And it's false. And Abdelkader Habak was not part of the terrorist attack in Raishdin. He rescued a child from the terrorist attack in Raishdin. The accusation is false. It's disgusting. And they probably know it's false. Yeah. And then...
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, and the allegation that he was at Sheikhoun hospital when the chemical attack happened there.
So Khan Sheikhoun is in Idlib, right? You're talking about an Idlib-based correspondent. There, could you reread the claim they made about that, just so we can?
Sure. Yeah. He was apparently quote present at Khan Sheikhoun Hospital at the precise moment it was allegedly subjected to a chemical attack. Footage of the incident showed him seemingly unfazed by the purported strike.
Yeah, Khan Sheikhoun Hospital was not subject to a chemical attack. Khan Sheikhoun, the town, was subject to a chemical attack. It hit a relatively open area, killed dozens of people, and was the footage of. By the way, footage of the dead and dying is shocking and exists, and it's the kind of thing that they will never touch on. They'll continue to talk about a boy being hosed down for years to come, but the appalling footage of children suffocating to death on camera from sarin poisoning is something that they won't address. And that's the incident that took place, was an incident when an open road in the town of Khan Sheikhoun in Idlib was struck by a sarin bomb and killed a lot of people. The incident that Habak witnessed was several hours later, when the wounded were being treated at a hospital. The regime, as it does, bombed the hospital, probably with rockets, possibly with dumb bombs, but they were conventional explosives. They were not chemical weapons. And considering the fact that this man is a journalist in Idlib, it stands to reason that within a couple hours of there being a gigantic chemical weapons incident, which killed dozens, if not up to 100, that they would cover the wounded. This isn't a surprise, and it's several hours later. So what he did witness was the bombing of the hospital that was treating the wounded. It was not a chemical attack. And the person that wrote this article trying to smear him didn't bother to go through any of these basic details. But it's a ludicrous smear. So their position officially is, well, sure, this podcast criticizes us and has some important point, but its producer is a spy. We don't have any evidence. They interviewed someone in the military once. And one of the translators and researchers is a terrorist who had part in planning a chemical attack because he covered the wounded from the chemical attack. That would be like saying that because I went to film some of the people that were survivors on 9/11, which I did, right? Because I live in New Jersey. My father and I on 9/11 tried to film some of the aftermath because it's a historical event, right? That would be like saying, Pat, how did you know that 9/11 was going to happen in New Jersey? Because you went to go film the survivors in New Jersey, right? You were right there when the survivors arrived in New Jersey and the attack hit New Jersey, right? Oh, no, it hit New York, right? It's that big a fuck up. It's that stupid what they've done. And it remains on their website. So you accuse people, they frequently will accuse people of McCarthyism. They'll accuse people of smearing others. They'll accuse people of using quote unquote neoconservative war on terror lingo. I can't think of anything that's more fucked up and McCarthyite and more neoconservative war on terror bullshit than blanketly accusing someone of being a terrorist because you don't like their opinion on you and because you know that people are racist against Muslims. And I'll add another point to this, which is that Aaron Mate posted a criticism of the white helmets that were doing a collection of samples in Al-Latamina. I believe it was Al-Latamina, because he claimed that there was a jihadist flag on the car that they were driving in, right? On the truck that was driving. His quote unquote jihadist flag, if you look at it carefully, it's actually a decal of the Shahada, which is an Islamic symbol, which if you go in New York, it's everywhere. The Shahada is a very frequent symbol that you see in New York. You see it in cars in New York. You see it very frequently in among less wealthy parts of the Sunni world. It's omnipresent in a lot of places as a vehicle. A lot of the time in New York City, if you have a driver who's from a Muslim nation, they'll have the Shahada in their car, right? And this is a purely Islamophobic bullshit attack that is reliant on the fact that people have a prejudiced view of Muslims. So at the end of the day, okay, sure, maybe it doesn't stand to reason that 40 plus bodies were planted at this location. Maybe the hundreds of incidents that are documented of chemical weapons being used has something to do with chemical weapons being used. Maybe the fact that Assad admitted that they had chemical weapons is sort of a red flag. But they say, no. I know that people see that symbol, they see that Arabic, and they'll think bad. And they'll think Arab, they'll think Muslim, they'll think terrorism. And they know that. And they're relying on it to push a narrative that dehumanizes Arab and Muslim people.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it is fact checked. That image, that decal on that truck is the Shahada. And the militant jihadist groups in northern Syria sometimes will use a Shahada because it's a religious symbol, just in the same way that a militant Christian might use a cross, right? But when it comes to, because I'm wearing a cross, I'm not a member of the KKK, right? Because I'm wearing, if I were to be wearing a Star of David, it would make me Zionist. These are religious symbols. And it's lazy, Islamophobic, paranoid right-wing bullshit to use these quote-unquote defenses for the smears that they put forward.
Really, yeah. And then one other thing about her back that you mentioned earlier was that it also, in the same way, it wasn't unsurprising that he went to the hospital to cover the chemical attack, and also wasn't unsurprising that he was there covering the evacuation. So they're perfectly
No,
good.
all the major outlets were, including.
Yeah.
I mean, I believe there were pro-government outlets there as well. There certainly were pro-government fighters. There's footage of the incident of the SARC and the White Helmets working together in close coordination to rescue survivors. There's footage of White Helmets helping to carry wounded government soldiers to safety. Now, I do think that a little bit of this emphasis on like, ooh, people must be unbiased in war zones, I think is a little bit extreme. As long as they're treating everybody medically, then it's fine. Whether or not they have personal opinions of, I don't like this guy I'm treating medically, that might be, but that's not what you're meant to judge. And I think that it's highly, highly disingenuous. And you'll often hear these people say, oh, that the White Helmets have never treated civilians on the government side or government soldiers, and it's completely false. And you can see it from these kinds of incidents where they have. Now, the reason that they've done it less is simple, is that White Helmets that have traveled through government territory have ended up in torture videos online. Right? So they're being hunted. So the idea to say, oh, yeah, why is it that there weren't that many Jewish doctors treating people in Nazi Germany? They're biased against Nazi Germany, right? Yeah, I mean, it's the same logic. It doesn't stand to any reason. And in places where there's been a chance for them to treat people that aren't from the same side as them, they have. And it's consistent. And Reich Dien is a perfect example of it. And from that incident in which people from all sides of the conflict worked together after some extremist fuck decided to upend a deal, is a good example of how civil society can overcome sectarianism. And what they have taken from that is an opportunity to smear a hero who rescued a child as the perpetrator of that incident. They are exploiting the fact that they are picking on someone who lives in Syria, right? Somebody that can't sue them the way that, if they said that about me, I could sue them, and I would. If they said that about somebody else, you could sue them. But no, they said it about an Arab-speaking person living in Idlib. It's not a coincidence. It's shameful, and it's skin-deep Islamophobic bullshit.
My next question is, what are your thoughts on the smearing of James Linder's viewing? So he's the founder of the White Helmets, and specifically the claim that he ran and is.
He's not quite the founder. It's a bit of a misnomer. He was an advocate for them and a director of Mayday that was able to partner with them to significantly boost their capacity and their presence. But I think founder is a bit of a strong word.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
There was sort of like proto White Helmets in existence prior to this. But I do think that it's part and parcel of the typical shoot the messenger philosophy that people who whitewash war crimes will generally go to. I mean, the fact that the Al Jallah Tower in Gaza was bombed, it's not shocking that the Israelis are trying to make sort of an obtuse case that Hamas has used it, because in their argument they can say, oh well, Hamas was on the same block. Okay, so what? Like it's a tiny society. There are people of all kinds of different belief systems in various areas, and the kind of bullshit smear that the Israelis pulled out to try and claim that the Al Jallah Tower was somehow a military target is the same bullshit that you'll see, the same guilt by association shit that you'll see gray zone people do when it comes to Syria. And it's just the fact that actually an interesting factoid is that a lot of the medical equipment in Gaza comes from USAID. A lot of these medics that are pulling people out of the rubble in Gaza got some support from USAID. Now, they're not getting enough support from USAID. I think they should get a huge amount more. And I respect them for that. But it's just the fact that unquestionably the United States has interests, and unquestionably the United States has leveraged humanitarian aid for its self-interest. And that's a worthy discussion. But in terms of saying you should stop digging people out of the rubble in Syria, but people in Gaza should keep digging people out of the rubble, by the way, you both get funding from USAID, right? I just don't see it as being something that's morally defensible. I don't see that as being morally defensible. And I think, and also to boot, I respect the ambulance drivers in Israel who are responding to incidents there. Now, it would be offensive to say that their job is as challenging as the rescue workers in Gaza, because the rescue workers in Gaza are dealing with a military apartheid occupation that has lasted their entire lives. Whereas the medics in Israel are dealing with people that are wounded by let's call it terrorism that's being committed to try and liberate and oppress and colonize society. It doesn't make the tactic right, but it's in the context of a long running occupation, and the two roles are not really comparable. But they all deserve protection, and they're all medics, and they're all saving people. And I think that they are not targets. And Israel has made medics target, and Russia has made medics a target, and the Assad regime have made medics a target. Incidentally enough, the Assad regime has actually bombed the white helmets and posted "We bombed the white helmets" on their social media, celebrating it. So it's not like it's a fucking secret. And we saw what Israel did in broad daylight by bombing the Al Jala Tower and by bombing hospitals, bombing the roads up to the waist of the hospitals, targeting medics with snipers, sending drones to harass medics, everything. The complexity of the war against medics in general is astounding. And it's I should also point out, I actually have an interesting sort of anecdote about that, if you'd like to hear it. So I wrote my piece I recently wrote for Haaretz about the Israeli-made drones being used to target being used to help target civilian structures in Syria by the Russian military. What prompted me to write the article was that the Russian military got complaints from Armenia that their weapons weren't working during the war with Azerbaijan. So Russia released a compilation of their weapons, quote unquote, working. And one of the videos that they released was drone footage of a guided missile hitting a building twice. A Twitter user was able to ID the building as the Azaz National Hospital, which is a hospital, kind of a rural hospital in the north of Syria near the border with Turkey. And when I saw that, I said, fucking hell, I think I've been to this hospital. And I started going through footage, and I could have sworn that I had interviewed a doctor that worked there, and I was going through my old footage from 2014 when I was in Azaz, right after ISIS had been booted out. And going through the footage, I found that I did indeed find an interview with the medic / ambulance driver. It wasn't at the same hospital, it was at a different hospital. And I said, what is it that I'm remembering? I was confused as to why I kept remembering the hospital. And then I realized, holy shit, there was an attempted airstrike on this same hospital the day that we were there, 2 years prior to the incident that the Russians filmed. So it's the most incredible thing, is that day that I was in Azaz in 2014, on June 10th, 2014, I believe the date was, I heard my friends in Syria said, oh, there was just a bombing. They tried to hit like something outside of town. And me and my colleague Anna said, can we go out there and see? And they said, oh, well, we think it's dangerous, but okay. And the footage I have, which I'll send you, is just really incredible because it just shows you as to how normal this kind of thing is for people. And the footage just shows us driving around in the fields outside of Azaz, asking random people where the explosion happened. And I think a shepherd ends up hopping in the car with us and just shows us where it is. And we drive up, and it's right across the street from the Azaz National Hospital. 2 bombs had hit the fields, and they'd wounded a civilian there. We were able to interview the civilian. Subsequently, when I found, so interestingly enough, the Syrian regime dropped dumb bombs on this thing, tried to hit it, tried to bomb the hospital. They missed. There were multiple other incidents of them trying to target it. And in 2016, the Russians, using Israeli technology and Russian guided missiles, finished the job and eradicated the facility. It's since been rebuilt by Turkey, who are also essentially an occupying force at this point. So there's a lot of layers of complexities to this story, but there's not a lot of we're innocent for anybody in this story, except for the people on the ground who are in fact innocent. And I think that story is interesting because it shows an interplay between, I basically not really registered that as being terribly significant. because it's so run of the mill and it's so paint by numbers that, yeah, of course they target hospitals. It's part of how a repressive government targets the population. And it wasn't the slightest bit surprising to us. It wasn't the slightest bit, it wasn't even newsworthy to us. We kind of just put it out of our minds. And so this whole thing about how like saying that incidents that do get attention are faked is really infuriating to me, because as I'd spoken before, I've come across a lot of human suffering from people that are just terrified to go on record about it. If you go around near the border with Syria and Turkey, which I actually don't recommend doing that now, but if you can speak to people that are from there somehow, a lot of people will tell you these personal horror stories. And a lot of the time, people will have zero possible incentive to have lied about it. Like, I remember often seeing people show me photos on their phones of them, like I described before, like Holocaust skinny, leaving Syrian regime detention facilities. And most of the time when people show you that kind of thing, they won't let you take a picture of it. They won't let you report on it. They won't let you do anything, because that intimidation doesn't end when they leave prison, and they still have relatives in Syria. So the idea that there's a market to fake atrocities is ludicrous, because the fact is that the incentive is to try and hide it, to try and not make yourself a target, the way that Aaron Mate helped the Russian intelligence services, or theoretically would have helped the Russian intelligence services turn survivors of the Duma chemical weapons attack into a target.
No, that's very that's a very interesting topic. And so back to the question about James. What are your thoughts on how he's been smeared? And others.
Sorry. So I think that it's a lot to do with shooting the messenger. Obviously, he is ex-military. There's no denying that. But the idea that that's a scoop is silly. Also, the idea that you can mount effective rescue operations against the military machine of death without the input of people that are ex-military is stupid. If I'm gonna save lives, I want people that know what's going on to be part of that. And I think that there's sort of just this willingness that when you create a boogeyman, it's easy to just throw anything you want at them. It's sort of just like the whole Soros argument. I mean, like, even I'm not even sure if it, like, I've heard Soros funded used as an insult against the white helmets before, and the gray zone is definitely dipping into Soros conspiracy theories a lot of the time. But they create sort of a boogeyman, and they repeat shit about him enough times to try and make it real. And it becomes this thing where it becomes such an echo chamber and such like a self-referential thing that in that article allegedly defending themselves, where they smeared Abed al-Qadr Habak, they just casually said, yeah, James Lemercier, who was suspected of links to chemical weapons attacks. It's not suspected of links to chemical weapons. That's a ludicrous, like quasi-cult, like religious mantra that they've ascribed to it, and they don't have a shred of evidence to back that up. They probably don't even know like which chemical weapons incidents occurred during his life and during his tenure with the White Helmets. And it's a meaningless accusation that isn't backed up by any substance. And they know it, but they know that they're dealing with a low information audience that is the type of audience that would see Soros and just say, oh yeah, well, of course, and they see something that they've demonized, and they're willing to overlook logic and reason to smear. And I think a really interesting example of this was how Max Blumenthal tried to imply that James was helping the Israelis imprison Palestinians. He said that James worked at an Israeli prison and helped the Israeli occupation forces hold Palestinian prisoners. And it's actually completely false. Is what James was he was part of what's called the Jericho Monitoring Mission, which was international observers who were liaisons to the Palestinian Authority, who had struck a deal to evacuate Ahmed Sadat and some other PFLP members from Yasser Arafat's compound, the Palestinian Authority compound in Ramallah. Right? And during the last days of the Second Intifada, up until 2005, right when Arafat died, the Arafat's, the headquarters of the Palestinian Authority and his compound in Ramallah was surrounded by the Israeli forces. And it became sort of a flashpoint with a lot of members across the political spectrum of the Palestinians coming to show solidarity. And Ahmed Sadat of the PFLP, of the PFLP, was at the Palestinian Authority compound with Arafat during the Israeli siege. And there was a condition to try and lift the siege because the Israelis wanted to come take those people prisoners. Arafat refused, the Palestinian Authority refused, and eventually a deal was struck, whereas the Palestinian Authority said, we are willing to hold these people, right, as prisoners of the Palestinian Authority, provided they have a certain level of comfort when they're being held, and provided it's us who do it, right? Because we don't want the Israelis having them. And a deal was struck, the Palestinian Authority consented to it, and a prison was built in Jericho, quote unquote prison, to hold the PFLP members. And this was with the full consent of the Palestinian Authority, and it was at the request essentially of the Palestinian Authority. And James's role was as a liaison to the Palestinian Authority to help them normalize this, to help them make this to help them have like a normal procedure to follow so that it could be done safely. And interestingly enough, it was the Israelis who considered this to be no good, to be a bad deal. And they came in and they killed several of the guards who were Palestinian Authority soldiers, or cops basically, who were doing what they could to try and enforce this deal to keep their people out of Israeli custody. And James was a liaison officer who tried to make that a possibility. But James eventually left the Jericho monitoring mission to do other work. And after he left, years after he left actually, the Israeli forces launched an assault on the prison and killed members of the security forces, the Palestinian security forces, whose facility it was. It was a Palestinian facility. And the Israelis murdered these people who were only enforcing a deal. And so to smear James as having been part of the Israeli occupation because he was a liaison officer to try and help the Palestinian Authority conform to an agreement that they wanted, right? An agreement which the Israelis clearly were unhappy with and were willing to kill. They were so unhappy with it. To say that that's James being on the side of the occupation is dog shit. It's him acting as a liaison to the Palestinian Authority. But of course, it's more of just the lazy bullshit smears.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that Gaza has come up quite a lot in the background in this discussion for obvious reasons, because it's so important what's happening there. So let's address that directly. So I was wondering how you feel about the response from the international community and the Biden administration in particular for what's happening in Gaza.
I mean, I never had high hopes for Biden, obviously, because I'm a pretty rabid Bernie Sanders supporter. But I do think that it's still been shockingly appalling, the response from the United States. I can't say that I'm surprised, but the fact that in 2021, that we have fucking Obama's vice president telling us that Israel has a right to defend itself in the context of this massacre, this wanton, naked aggression that's going on against civilians is disgusting. And this is the nightmare scenario that all of us that supported Bernie Sanders pointed to. Because the fact is that I am a socialist, if I'm being honest. You know what I mean? Like, I'm coming out as like a socialist, and it's like I'm a socialist. But like, it doesn't like the real reason that I was a Bernie Sanders supporter is because I think that we should not be complicit in things like this. Like, I don't think we should be complicit in colonial projects. And I don't think that we should be complicit in war crimes, or that we should continue committing war crimes. And it's like, yes, clearly Biden is better than Trump, obviously, right? But when you compare like a Joe Biden to the rational, there were things I disagreed with Bernie about, but like the rational proposals that Bernie had for foreign policy when it came to issues like Israel-Palestine, it's just the fact that his proposal essentially boiled down to we should have some fucking morality, for God's sake. You know, like you can argue pro or anti-interventionism in the broader context. There are some situations where Bernie Sanders has supported intervention. Like in Kosovo, there are many situations where Bernie Sanders has opposed intervention, like in 1990, when we intervened against Iraq. And interestingly enough, one of the things that he cited in his war opposing the 1991 Gulf War was the fact that the United States was supporting the Hafez Assad regime against Iraq because they were pro-Iranian while Iraq was against Iran. And as a result, it created an alliance of convenience between the United States and the Assad regime of the Assad Senior. And Bernie Sanders, because he's a morally consistent person, mentioned that. And he called it a terrorist regime. And he said that we shouldn't be allies with a terrorist regime. And as far as like a consistent foreign policy, I think he had some people that were maybe a little goofy around him, but the man has fucking moral clarity. And at the end of the day, it's getting harder and harder to frame some of these things in a-religious terms. Like it's just fucking wrong. Like it's just fucking wrong. And there's no debate over truth here. It's just become cut by numbers. And like the international order has broken down so much to a point where things like the UN Security Council are completely meaningless. Because if you look at the countries that are on the UN Security Council, United States, France, Britain, China, and Russia, right? 5 permanent members, yeah. Like apart from Assad and Saudi Arabia and Israel, there's no one could be worse. To be like, it's some of the worst, it's the most powerful and like shameless countries are the ones that are the decision makers. And then even worse is it's the governments of the most powerful and shameless countries that are decision makers. So at the end of the day, it was the disconnect between human beings and the people that make the rules for them is just going to grow. And you have an international order that's based on a system where people out of self-interest can just veto the right for human beings to live. Like Russia has consistently vetoed cross-border aid into Idlib as a means of exerting pressure on the civilians that live there. The United States constantly vetoes resolutions condemning Israel for what it's blatant. It doesn't serve our interest. There's no we don't really have mutual enemies with Israel anymore. Like it's not, they aren't doing anything. They're providing nothing to the United States, like less than nothing, you know? And what they're, and I don't have a problem with Israelis at all. It's not nothing to do with that, you know, like it's a cool society in like a lot of ways. Like there's a lot of potential there. It's just that, I'm sorry, like, you cannot build progress on apartheid. And as it is now, it's apartheid all the way down. Like even to, there are things that like mimic democracy in Israel, right? Like the fact is that I just wrote an article in an Israeli paper essentially accusing Israel of having facilitated a war crime in Syria. True, and I stand by it. But so there's that element of freedom of speech. But man, if I was an American citizen, that freedom of speech might not go so far. If I was a Palestinian, if I was a Palestinian citizen of Israel, if I was a Palestinian with a Jerusalem permit, and it's like this, no society that's truly democratic could possibly have that kind of like those rungs of citizenship that we see, right? Like you have, it basically goes in like order of like as a quote unquote Arab in Israel, which is Palestinian citizen of Israel, is how they like to be referred to themselves, right? You're automatically a second class citizen. It goes without saying that you're a second class citizen. Their members of the Knesset are not allowed to participate in security matters, right? The fact that they're not drafted is used against them like a bludgeon. Like it means, oh wow, we're not requiring you to murder your family, so you should thank us, right? Is an insane argument. And then on top of it, they are requiring people to murder other Palestinians because Druze get drafted, some Bedouin get drafted. There's a whole fucking mess, you know, of different classes of order. So if you're Druze, you're slightly better on the rung in terms of like the apartheid system that they have there than if you're Bedouin, right? But if you're Bedouin, you might be slightly better on the rung if you come from certain areas versus if you come from the Negev, then you're a third class citizen because that's in the way of one Zionist project, right? The Negev is somewhere where they want to create developments that might displace some of the Bedouin there. So the Bedouin there lose their status and then you're a third class citizen now because we want to do something there. So the idea that the entire Holy Land is this like Tetris game that can just be rearranged for whatever is most convenient for like the most Zionist element, it is not sustainable. And you can't like, it's like a multi-rung society. It goes from, you know, if you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, Druze, if you're Bedouin, if you're Palestinian Arab, and then like a Jerusalem citizen, a person that has the Jerusalem ID passport, and also a lot of people believe that Palestinians in Jerusalem are allowed to vote. They're not. They're allowed to travel. They can travel to Israel. They can't fucking vote. So they act like this is some gift to humanity that, you can't criticize us because we let the people whose skin color is slightly different from us and whose religion is different from us and whose language is different from us move around in the country they were born. Like, there's just no argument. And I don't even think that the left is really divided on this, like, at all. And I don't even think the center is divided on this. I just think that we have this situation where the status quo is so abhorrent and disgusting that we have like a situation now where we have, apart from Tulsi Gabbard, we have the two worst Democrats. Like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden were the worst. Like, they were the worst two possible candidates on the Democratic ticket besides Tulsi Gabbard, in my opinion. And we let stupid bullshit about like whether or not Elizabeth Warren is good enough divide us when, I'm sorry, this was going to be the consequence, man. Like, there being a Democrat with a very strong neoconservative pro-Israel bend being the de facto unchallengeable figurehead of the Democratic Party was the inevitable outcome of there being petty squabbles over stupid bullshit on the left. And we all saw this coming. We all knew that Joe Biden's weaknesses were a crime. His support for the crime bill, which also Bernie Sanders supported, his naked support for like sort of neoconservative ideas, and the support for the Gulf War, like support for the Patriot Act. There's all these things. I mean, it's not a coincidence that why Barack Obama initially, when like we believed and had faith in him, won against Hillary Clinton. In my opinion, it's because he opposed the Patriot Act and he opposed the Iraq War. Like, it's that simple. Just, he took a position that was principled and he stuck with it. And whereas Hillary Clinton was always seen as like sort of playing to interests, right? In one way or another. And I just think that it's a real tragedy that we're taking this, like, that we're sort of like taking like this, we're taking this approach of thinking that it had to be this way, like this idea that the moderation is not possible, right? This idea that Elizabeth Warren would have been as bad as Biden, right? Like, I'm a Bernie Sanders supporter, not a Warren supporter. But my point is that you have to understand what the situation is that because we have Biden now, we don't have the pressure that we could have had to try and effect a change for Palestine, period. If we'd had Elizabeth Warren, it would have been 10 times better. If we had Bernie Sanders, it would have been 100 times better. And now, because we let this stupid shit divide us, we have these Democrats that are essentially moderate Republicans, right? So they're not Trumpians. Like, I don't think Joe Biden's personally racist, but he, by default, because he is like the intellectual blob that he is going to support Israel because he's just an empty suit that has literally been filled with like all of the incompetence and mediocrity of the Democratic Party for the past 40 years. And our unwillingness to abandon petty, like unnuanced ideological ideas over an acknowledgement that what we're looking at is humanitarian disasters that are man-made by our allies, by our weapons, and by our capitalism, honestly, right? The idea that this wasn't going to be the outcome is ludicrous. And I think that we need to start, like, those of us on the left need to start really putting these issues where a bunch of people get fucking killed and oppressed at the forefront, right? Like, I support Medicare for all, no doubt, right? I think it's worth making a stand for Medicare for all. I absolutely agree. But I do think that issues like that have some complexity, that there are some people that just don't want it. Like, in America, there's a significant portion of the population that just doesn't want Medicare for all. And I think that those people should be convinced to want Medicare for all, and we should have it eventually, and we should fight for it. But there shouldn't be any segment of society that thinks it's a good idea for us to be sending bombs to Israel, right? Yet there's no debate in the end. It's just like these petty squabbles over who's more left or whatever. And the fact is that we could have had a broader coalition. And I don't think it's Bernie Sanders' fault at all, actually. But I do think that we, a lot of people that supported him did a disservice by not like putting some of those issues front and center, because we should have known this would be the outcome. If we had a President Sanders right now, we would be looking at like a less chaotic point right now for the situation in Palestine. And it's going to be a flashpoint that's going to affect the next 4 years dramatically. And we're fucked now, because we have a president that doesn't represent any higher ideal. All he represents is that he's not overtly a fascist, right? And that's a really, really low bar.
Because there was recently a ceasefire announced, and I think that you're like a lot younger than me, but seeing this it just feels like a nightmare version of Groundhog Day, because there's constantly some incident will happen where Israel horribly violates the rights of Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem, right? Then there will be understandably civil protests, right, as happens. Then the Israelis will use lethal force to suppress essentially nonviolent demonstrators, or mostly nonviolent demonstrators. And then naturally that produces furious response from Hamas, which usually doesn't kill anyone. And then Israel bombs the fuck out of Gaza, kills hundreds of civilians, pretends it's a military target, justifies everything, and nothing changes about Hamas's leadership. They don't achieve anything that they claim are military objectives, and they just kill a bunch of civilians, and then we have a ceasefire, and the world celebrates it. And this is not really a ceasefire. It's just a return to a colonial status quo of what is occurring in Gaza and the West Bank. And there's this notion that because there are not Israeli settlements in Gaza, that it's not occupied territory. That's bullshit, because all means of ingress and egress are controlled by the occupation forces or are controlled by the Sisi government. And the Sisi government is a collaborationist government of Israel. If Sisi were ever overthrown, he should go on trial as a collaborator with Israel, because he is one. And he's allowed Israeli drone strikes in his territory. He coordinates closely with the Israeli forces. I believe his troops have murdered Palestinian civilians to try and enforce the blockade on Gaza. So the idea that Gaza is somehow free because it has one tiny little border with an Arab country that is purely a collaborationist regime is ludicrous. And moving forward, people will act as if this was some kind of a achievement for peace, or as if Biden somehow wasn't responsible for this. And the fact is that Biden is responsible for this, because he could have, on day one, he could have called Netanyahu and said, "We're against you. If you do this, we'll respond." Simple. If you do this, we'll respond somehow. I don't know how, but we will. We're not going to do nothing. Whereas when you do something, what he did, which is veto UN resolutions condemning Israel, and reassert the quote unquote right for Israel to exist, which I think that people that are there have a right to their nationality, but they have a right to exist. The citizens of Israel have a right to exist. The citizens of Israel have a right to be Israeli if they want. But the national segregated entity of Israel, as we see it now, doesn't have any inherent right to exist. That's not correct. You know, they have a right to justice, but they don't have, or they have a right to equal rights, but they don't have an inherent right to exist. And we've seen a situation where this atrocity has set the region on fire and has been a disaster. And we had people throughout the campaign calling Bernie weak. Like, Bernie Sanders was called weak, and he's not even fucking president. And him and AOC are having to take the initiative to try and deal with this, to try and address it. And I think that, so at the same time, I think that the person that we really, really, really now deserves hell to pay over this is Joe fucking Biden. Because this is what you get when issues like the fact that we endlessly support the status quo across the world with dictatorships and occupations don't get addressed. When we don't deal with these systematic issues, the second somebody chooses to escalate them and turn them into a fucking bloodbath, America is impotent. And Bernie Sanders, even though he's not fucking president, is leading the initiative to try and fix this shit. And we have a leadership that just doesn't exist. I mean, to say when civilians are being killed and you can't, and your spokesman at the State Department can't condemn it, that's weakness, and that should terrify the shit out of us. So important things to remember now. I think that people should make sure not to stop protesting for Gaza, because it's an ongoing military occupation and it's not over yet. And the status quo will result in more violence no matter what happens. After the ceasefire, Israeli forces have raided the Temple Mount again after the ceasefire. So they've repeated the incident that caused, or they've repeated part of the incident in addition to the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. Sorry, not the evictions, the expulsions in Sheikh Jarrah, right? In addition to the expulsions in Sheikh Jarrah, Israel is now repeating one of the aggravating incidents that they did, which is raiding the Temple Mount, right? And all these things have happened, and nothing about the status quo has changed. All that's happened is that this violence is being normalized. And so for those of us who are on the left, who want to bitch about that want to complain about left purity tests, about like, do you like Noam Chomsky enough, or do you think Maduro sucks or not? Like these kind of questions as left purity tests are I think pretty embarrassing when it comes to when the reality is that we have the United States providing more arms to Israel now, and aid for Israel increasing, and the lethality of the aid for Israel increasing, and then new weapons being developed, new kinds of guided munitions that can take out the foundation of a building instantly, and will kill even more people if a building blows up. And the pretext of these is that they're targeted munitions, but they're being used to target civilian structures, and they will be used to target civilian structures. And the United States official position is that they don't dispute this, and they'll sell more. So right now, Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are going to introduce legislation to prevent the sale of bombs to Israel, right? It won't pass, but this is a huge step. And this isn't something that when it gets defeated by like mainstream Democrats, that we should abandon. And it's something that should continuously be a point. And we've seen from the public reaction that this should be a point for the Democrats. The fact that it's not a point for the Democratic Party to raise this automatically is shameful. And it doesn't reflect the desires of the electorate. People want this over. People don't want the United States to be complicit in this, and we're deeply complicit in it. So if you're somebody that considers yourself leftist, this is something that we have to move on. You have to keep writing your representatives. If you're going to go to meetings with the DSA or whatever, make sure that they keep protesting for Palestine. Make sure that make sure that the representatives that have the ears of the left who are still in Congress, instead of shitting on those people and complaining about how mainstream they are, maybe listen to some of the suggestions that they've had. Because it's just the fact that AOC, Ilhan Omar, Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, all have raised hell about this, right? And it doesn't make them unpatriotic. It doesn't make them anything. It makes them very patriotic, in fact. And we have, there are people like Jimmy Dore on the left or whatever that are going to get into the business of left punching AOC and Ilhan Omar simply because they know that a large portion of their audience are sort of fash adjacent conservatives, right? That love to hear someone that claims to be leftist sort of support their hatred of these people. But the fact is, it's pure opportunistic left punching of women of color, and these women who have taken office in the past few years have truly radicalized what it is to call yourself a socialist, what it is to participate in elections. I considered not voting. I've considered not voting several times before. And since we've had like the squad actually speaking up, and since I feel that I actually have a voice in Congress, even though I wasn't unfortunately able to vote for all of them because they're not in my districts, but I still feel that now there are people who are elected who are going to say what Israel's doing is an occupation, what Israel's doing is apartheid, what Israel's doing is illegal, and we should appreciate that we have that and try to lean into it as much as possible and to try and keep that fight up, because it's ongoing and it's going to happen again. And the Israelis are going to keep testing peace and trying to normalize the violence and racism that is the foundation of the occupation. And they can't keep doing it without our complicity. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what else to say. It's just that's my take on the situation. I do think I think essentially what's going on now is our fault. Like that's not a big stretch, but it's like it's even more our fault than it ever was at this point, because all you have to do to stop this is to stop actively supporting, right? If we stop actively supporting and actively being complicit in like this cover-up of naked atrocities in public, then they will become harder to commit. It's just a fact. People fear consequences.
It was a very insightful analysis, Patrick. So thank you. And I would encourage everyone listening to follow closely what's happening in Gaza and not forget Sheikh Jarrah and the other root causes for what has caused this latest round of I think I'm going to conclude there, Patrick. But
sure, absolutely.
Thank you very much for taking the time to this. This has all been great, and it's been great to hear about your analysis of events, but also your personal experience actually being there. So
absolutely, thank you so much. It's been you've had some very insightful questions, and I really appreciate it. So I'll talk to you soon. Cheers.
Talk to you soon. All right. Bye. Thank you. Bye.